Welcome everybody to another episode of Notes from the Aleph. An Aleph is a high point from which all things are visible, and from our vantage point, we'll be looking at tabletop role-playing games, their design, and the theory behind those designs. Around here, our motto is be fair, build up, and have fun. I'm your host, GriffinVarro, joined by our editor Theta, our local designer Norman Rafferty, and our good friends and GMs RedRabbit and Lessons Learned. When it comes to tabletop role-playing games, I have 15 years of experience running, playing, and frequently fixing problematic rules at the table. Pronouns he, him, they, them. Lessons, why don't you go?
My pronouns are he, him. I'm Lessons Learned. Lessons Learned 1 here on Twitch. Lessons Learned over YouTube channel. I talk about games, mostly video games, but also tabletop RPGs. I also run a game here on Sundays, Shadowrun Mirrored Souls, if I can say that 3 times fast. And also I run a stream currently running a Dragon Age Inquisition, which is a very, very long game. But yeah, we're probably going to finish it up somewhere in this month, I think. Yeah, that's me.
Rafferty.
This works better when I'm muted.
Yeah.
Hello world, I'm Norman Rafferty, he, him. I work for Sanguine Games for the last 20 plus years. So we're making new stuff. We're angry at make-believe.
All right, and last but not least, Red, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yes, that is the new back of the book quote. We are angry at make-believe. I am RedRabbit. I, too, am angry at make-believe. I'm running our Wednesday Ironclaw game here on the channel, and I'm playing in our Forbidden Lands game on Sunday mornings. Do a lot of morning gaming on this channel, which is not something I would advise you do. I own a lot of tabletop role-playing games, and I play fewer of them. I'd like to play more of them, though.
There you go. And now on to today's subject. So, you want to set up a visit to a castle so your players can get some well-needed information on what's going on in your plot. So, do you painstakingly detail out the residents of the castle, their hopes and dreams, and see what they might happen to wander into? Or do you just place them down where they need to be and try to hit the emotional chords that you want to see in order to gain their motivation to follow your story? What role do you take in crafting your adventures and campaigns? Are you directing a play, or are you designing a set meant to be explored? Today, we'll be looking at these different methods and how to look at building your adventure. So maybe I'll start off with this with a parallel to draw. And I think that would definitely be if you go to Disney World or Disneyland, whichever it is, you will experience both. There are rides you can sit down on that tell you what to do, and there are areas for you to explore and walk around. And both are important when you're kind of doing a role playing thing with people. You want to have a place for them to explore if they have questions, and you want things there that are important. Neither is necessarily worth more or less than the other, right?
First of all, I think if I were to take that analogy, I would say it's the guided tour versus the walk-in, the free pass, right?
Yeah.
Like the first time you go to Disney World, you should take a guide. It's huge and you don't know what to do and where to go. But after a while, if you've been there before, it's like, I don't need a tour guide. I know where to go. I know what I want to do. I want to do it in a certain order, et cetera, et cetera. So one, you have to follow the tour guide and they have a schedule. And the other one is, I know what I want. And if we can do it, fine. If not, then so be it, right? I'm the one who will always say, from recently onwards, toolkit, because I think a lot of the problems, especially we talked about in earlier episodes, comes from the idea of the expectation that the GM is the one that it's a GM story, right? It's my story. I bring it to the table and the players just have to play. And statements like, my players derailed the adventure, or they went off script, or they're ignoring the plot point or plot line, comes from the thinking that you're more of a director. And I see the problem as like, well, the problem is that you're bringing a plot, right? You're not bringing ideas. You're not bringing characters. You're bringing a plot. Sit there, say your lines, roll your die. In 2 hours, we're done. Good game. Right.
I think here would probably be a good point to like differentiate that, right? Where we have talked about like linear storytelling and like putting people onto rails before, but necessarily writing a script doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be doing that. You might have a monologue you want someone to say, you might have an idea of like, here's 2 choices the players can make. I'm going to have something nice prepared so that when they do it, I have something to say. If they walk into a room, you want to write a script about like what the room looks like, so you could just say it and not have to like go over every single detail as like an item list.
No, but I think that's just a tool. That's just another tool. That is, it's like if you were to buy a map, right, and it had tables and stuff like that, and it's like, well, I just put this table here, stuff like that. There's a series of tools that I have, and I deploy those tools whenever it's necessary, because it could be that the players decide they don't want to go into that room, at least not yet, right? Whereas script is players will go to this room, right, and they will talk to the statue, and they will do a search here and there. One thing is to be prepared, and the other one is the expectation that your players have to follow certain steps, not because they're the optimal steps or because that's a way to get what they want, but because you as a GM have an expectation for them to do those things. And whenever the player decides, well, yeah, I just want to sit down and take 5 minutes or 15 minutes to talk to my other player about, our failed marriage or something, like, but there's a combat encounter in 15 minutes. You got to go there, and we talked about earlier about dissatisfaction, why people win, etc. It's, I think, part of that greater idea that, and I see this a lot when people ask for advice and they complain about players, they make this sort of meme joke about, the players went off scripts. Like, my answer is like, why do you have a script? Why do you have a plot, right? You should have tools that as you play the game more and more, and you're more familiar with the rules, again, we talked about this earlier podcast show, they're easier to deploy, right?
I would build on that saying, like, so we have seen a rise or a lot of games that talk about storytelling. And one thing that usually bothers me is that you'll usually get like a game like Canticle the Monomyth or Fiasco, or like games that like are totally take place in some zine land of like artiness. But then when you get to a game, a modern tabletop game, we keep talking about how the GM is scripting the adventure, which is weird because each player made their own character. So we didn't write the whole thing. They wrote a character. In fact, it's the era of intelligent design. You didn't randomly assign one. You picked this. And you made everything about this up. So in theory, you're here for a reason. And one thing that annoys me about a lot of like mainstream games like Shadowrun, Vampire, and D&D is that the players are considered to have a very passive role in the story complex. That the GM presents a scenario of, this is what we're going to do today, and the players are assumed to be a bunch of murder tourists or mercenaries for hire and are going to passively go along with this because it's today's adventure. Whereas no one's asking the players, hey, what do you want to do?
I think that is important of like being the director in this instance. You do want to like prod your players with that and see what are you going to be contributing, but also you do kind of in some ways want to tell people this is how you should feel, or like here's a direction you might want to go. Because if you do just set up a toolbox, if you do just have a large sandbox where players could do anything, and you just ask them, what do you want to do today? Some of them will just kind of shrug and go, I don't know. What's the plan for today?
I feel like I definitely feel like we're jumping to the extremes, and they're easy to jump to because there's a lot of common problems that come from these extremes, right? So when you say like, okay, the script, the GM has the entire thing laid out and we're just along for the ride, right? That is an example of it commonly going wrong. But I think that if you asked anyone, I think if you polled a lot of game masters, you would find that very few of them show up to the game with just like a stack of maps and a stack of random tables, and they sit down and they say, where you want to go? And then they just start rolling things and telling you, how many goblins jump out, or like, what random loot is in this room.
Yeah, now, if you're not doing the 3-act structure, you usually will try to start off a session with like an inciting incident to get people to think around it.
Wait, I gotta inject this here. Yeah, Griffin, wouldn't the worst game in the world be just some big map that you're just uncovering hex by hex to make some kind of king? Wouldn't that be the worst thing ever?
I mean, so what you're talking about is like I mentioned this in an earlier podcast, this idea, the dream, the golden dream of system mastery, this idea where you could on the fly inject mechanics into whatever the scene called for, whatever the narrative brought you to. But I think that, and there's probably people out there who are exceptionally good at that particular thing. But I think that the reality of preparing games and playing games falls somewhere in the middle, right? GMs are going to have toolboxes created to help them do that, inject that mechanics into whatever happens. But they're also going to come to the table with, they should also come to the table with some sort of inciting incident, some notion of events that can generate drama, because I think everyone has, maybe not everyone, I have been in the situation where you've sat down and parties sat down and you've said, okay, well, so what do you guys want to do next? And everyone just looks at one another and shrugs their shoulders. And so continues another 3-hour in tavern conversation that turns into like a poetry contest.
But here's the thing. And I talk about adding, because those things are also tools. The inciting incident is a tool. Plot points can be tools. NPC reactions are tools. All these are tools. I think it's about the attitude. It's about how you approach the game, right?
I
think we have different definitions. I think we have different definitions of tools.
I agree that it's about how you approach the game. But I'm going to, once again, take this from the game design standpoint and say, like, the games have largely sculpted the players to be passive. Most of the games are obsessed with the being of your character. What do you look like? What's your appearance? What is your gender? What is your alignment? Which is how you passively react to stuff. And then they give you passive choices like neutral or chaotic good. Or if you're playing a game like Vampire, what is your virtue? What is your vice? How do you react to certain situations or get involved with that kind of stuff? What's your clan? All these questions about being. We're not asking players coming out of the gate saying, what is one thing you want actively to do? Do you want to get rich? Do you want to kill monsters? Do you want to find the other half of this locket? Do you want to give Filthy Pierre the shiv between the ribs he so richly deserves? Do you want to get reunited with your lost love? I'm not saying everyone would ask this, but I'm saying that you look at a majority of these games and they don't even bother to ask that.
So I think in a lot of these games, and you're right, I'm not disagreeing, I think a lot of them are implying that on some level, the GM is supposed to provide that impetus, which I also think is a little bit flawed in design. But I want to go back to what Leston said, because I think maybe we're having like a semantic issue here. For me, personally, when I think the distinction between like what is scripted might not be the right word, but like what is, let's say, like GM agency versus what is a tool or a toolbox. I consider a toolbox to be something like a random table, something that is reusable, that is reactive. It's not an active part of the game. It's something where you say, the party has struck out into the wilderness. I did not expect them to do that. However, I have a table here that can generate events, encounters, and critters that they might find, and I can react to their decisions, right? So that's my definition of a toolbox. And then what I would say would be like the opposite of that is this idea that I came to the game today saying, hey, you guys sit around the inn, and then a dude with an eye patch and bad breath comes and tells you of a treasure that he knows of but can't get because of his bum leg. Like, that's something that is script, you know?
Right, and randomizing up a table for that kind of thing is complicated and arbitrarily produces results that maybe aren't always good. But, the best use for a toolbox almost certainly is filling in that empty space. The example here was wilderness encounters, where, well, you're not going to plan out or anything for your session for just random swaths of wilderness most of the time. You may as well just have a table there, and suddenly all this empty space now has something filling it. And that's work you don't necessarily have to put in.
Okay, I think... Yeah, I think it's also an idea of how you prep for adventures and how much, if anything, you do prep. And I think, it is not so much semantic, it's more about how expansive or limited is the idea of the toolbox and how expansive or limited is the idea of the script, right? Do they overlap or not? Are they, distinct to the point that they never meet? Because for me, in the sample of the man with the eye patch, I would say that that's part of my NPCs that are in my toolbox. Like, I need a stock character to introduce the adventure. I pull out my the way I see it, by the way, I pull out my stock character that has an eye patch. And I see it, that it's also true for me because I don't have the full knowledge of where this character is going to say or do until I literally talk to the players. Because one of my beliefs is nothing exists until it hits the table. When I pick this character out of the toolbox and plop him in the table to give the inciting incident. Oh, I need you guys to go and fetch me my boat or something, because it got lost in the storm. I don't have I don't. Some people do, but I usually don't. I used to do it, and I just forgot anyway, so I scrapped it. I was like, okay, I have a general idea how this character might talk what they want, right? I might have a note about that, but I don't have it written down. And I just engage the players, and as the players, there's a back and forth between me and the players, this character comes alive and the game comes alive. So maybe I'm more so describing how I do things in a very peculiar way that may not apply to anybody. Some people might need to write a paragraph because they need to have a more concrete version of the character, and they want to make sure that they hit those, points, because otherwise they don't convey the information to the players that they need, and therefore it's a wasted opportunity.
Well, yeah. I mean, like, all this is good planning, and once again, I'm getting kind of, like, here I am thinking of design, like, I'm getting kind of angry at how abstract this is. I keep hearing about how, like, players are somehow ciphers, that, I had no idea that my players were going to do this, or my players, when I asked them, had no motivation whatsoever to do anything. And to me, that just sounds like a failure of the game. Because it's like how would you not know? If you sat down to a D&D game, everyone here is to kill. Look at their sheets; they all have killing.
So let's take it into like a more concrete place. Let's talk about, like, you're a GM. You need to prepare for a game. What does it look like here?
Well,
what
that's
pieces
what I'm saying,
of this should you put together?
The first thing I'm suggesting here is prepare for your game. Like, when GMs are saying, "I did all this stuff," and the players didn't want to do it. Okay, like, let's examine that. It's like, okay, have you never met these people before? This is why I was down in your session 0. You can't have a session 0 and then be surprised that they didn't want to do session 1. What was the point of session 0? You were supposed to ask them what it was that they wanted to do in the game and what was important to them and how they wanted to express their characters, and then put that in the next session.
Yeah.
That's fair. I think, though, that... Sorry.
I'll go and say mine real quick. I always, like, in every one of my session notes, I'll have a part at the end where I say, here's things player said, here's things player did, and at the top of the next session's notes, all right, here are things I'm going to do, because these are things that people have literally given to me from the previous session. That's how it goes. You build a continuity based on what people are doing.
Yeah, I think my point, and I think that these are all good approaches. I think they're better approaches than just reading from a script. In fact, they're so good that it makes me wonder why anyone does use pre-published adventures, since ultimately they are going to be way more limiting than being able to react using, like, tools and toolboxes, right? And improvisation.
I can explain that.
Okay, well, let me get to that in a sec, because the point I wanted to make too, though, is that I'm sorry, my head is not working today. The point that I wanted to make is that all the things that we're talking about here are reactive, which is not bad. It's an improvisational game that's played at the table with other people. You should have tools ready, and you should be reacting to how the players make their characters, the choices they make at the table. These are important things, but I also don't want to disregard the fact that the GM is also a player. And I defy you to find a GM who doesn't come to the game with some opinion about dragons and whether they are cool or not, or, the choices in the monsters that show up, the choices in the settings and locales. You don't have to write a script to still be bringing some sort of your own agency to the game, and I think everyone does. Even if you don't want to cop to doing it, I think you do as well. So that's when I consider the difference between a toolbox and, like, GM agency is what I'm going to call it now, is that tools are kind of agnostic and reactive, and GM agency is what your hopes and dreams are that you're bringing to the table, and should not be prescriptive, but should also, add something to the soup. So that's all I want to get out. Sorry, Raph, what were you going to say?
Oh, no, it's, well, I mean, I can build on that. It's like, well, we've all been in a game where the GM had an NPC that they really liked. Yeah, but that's a different toxic discussion. Yeah, and I think, I mean, I guess what I'm kind of getting here is, like, when it comes to the toolbox, I mean, it's the poor craftsman who blames the tools. So you've got to, you should be bringing the right stuff. Like I said, your players should not be ciphers. You should have asked them what it is they wanted to do. And the games we design, we force everyone showing up to pick one thing they want to do before we even get to the table. I mean, you can't be surprised. If it's D&D, everyone's going to kill stuff and take treasure. If it's vampire, you can't be surprised. Everyone's a vampire. You can't be surprised. It's the game already channeled everyone into. If you're running Shadowrun, you're not all corporate CEOs or princesses trying to get back to the Lost Kingdom. You're all Shadowrunners. So the game's already channeled players into that, and then you can ask your players a bit more. And when it comes to published adventures, see, this is where I would take issue with that a published adventure is technically a toolbox. It is filled with locations, events, and characters that you would need, already specced out for you. They already did the math, balanced the numbers, and then offered challenge ratings and advice and how dangerous they are. They already have nice maps that you should be able to pick and choose at need. If a published adventure has an office complex and we never go there, hooray, I had it if I needed it, but it was in my toolbox. But if I didn't need the tool, any well-written published adventure would be one that has several hooks or several ways to use it. Like Zeb Cook, who became a primary D&D designer, wrote one of my favorite old school D&D adventures, Dwellers of the Forbidden City. This apparently is what got him hired from freelancer to full-timer. And it's one of my favorite adventure packs because it's full of all of these things, all of these reasons to go to the Forbidden City and then stuff to do when you're there. It could be a friend of yours has been framed for a crime and you want to acquit them. You have to escort a prisoner, and unfortunately you have to pass through the Forbidden City to do it. Or someone has been kidnapped and you have to go rescue them. The passive reasons, but also active reasons you might want to go there. And a bunch of suggestions about what to do when you're there. So you can ask, if you know your players like exploration, you can do this part. If you know they like killing, you can do this part. If you know they like socializing, we can do the crime adventure. And that way they've got several tools built in there of, if you want to do this with this adventure, this is how you would do it. It's a toolbox. And that's why that always stands out to me as like a better example of that. The thing I worry about all of this is we're constantly blaming the game master for, like, oh, they have to improv and go around all this. When really, I want to step back and look at the players. The players build characters. And if we're going to talk about how the GM is a player in the world, then we need to talk about how the players are GMs in the world. How much of the world are the players allowed to build? If I go to D&D and I pick nobility as my background, do I get to write up my noble family and their long dynasty? Or is that not relevant to the world? Because you'd think that would be.
Mm-hmm.
You used to, in old school D&D, when you were a cleric, you made up your own deity on the spot, because for some reason that's what you did. Can you imagine playing modern D&D that way? They always give you the list of deities and make you pick a domain when you get started. Like in other words, if we're going to say the GM is here to have fun and improv with the rest of everyone, what are we doing to get the players involved in helping you make the world too? Instead of the GM does whatever they want and the players go meh and respond to it. What are we doing to make the players involved?
I mean, also I want to answer Red's point. It's not. I don't think it's because you are the toolbox mentality that's purely reactive. Because yes, you bring. I mean, the act of bringing the toolbox is saying I want to bring locations. I want to bring story hooks, like mentioned at Dwellers of the Forbidden City, and it's a action reaction cycle, right? I usually the GM is the one that opens the session. Okay, you're in a tavern, or you're on road to somewhere, or you're getting a contract. The players listen to that and say, "Yeah, maybe I don't want to do that." Maybe. There's always space for surprises because people are people, right? And maybe you expect them. Yes, we're going to take the job, but we're going to decide to do other thing to approach this. And it's like, oh, that was in my approach. I have 3 ways it could approach this. And I think my take is that attitude of like the players going off script is that if they don't fit with my preconceptions, the adventure's over, right? We hit a hard wall. I think that's my attitude. And that's why I'm saying to fellow GMs and even players as well, and to designers, you have to allow for that, that space that gives you.
Well,
you have to allow for a greater space.
I gotta drop a big bomb here and say, don't have a script. Scripts are bad. Don't do them. I don't do them. You shouldn't do them.
Yeah, that's my take on it. But if we are going to, if we allow for the more expanded idea of Toolbox, then yes, sure, no scripts. It's everybody has agency, but they do have different roles. And so everybody has to play from each other, right? The GM has certain responsibilities, the player has certain responsibilities, and the designers has a responsibility to encourage everybody to play.
Yeah.
Give players motivations, give GMs motivations, and give a reason why everybody's sitting on the table playing.
Yeah. So
I
part of being the GM is, of course, to identify players and give them that motivation. You're the director. Tell them why they're acting.
Yeah, I do not disagree with the way that with the design principles or the running principles that you're talking about, lessons. I think that especially when opposed to scripts, you're totally right. I call it playing the ball where it lands, but it's the same philosophy of and I think my confusion is that when I read the title for this podcast, I have a preconceived notion of what a toolbox is versus what a script is, but you're right, and I totally agree. I think that what I usually say or how I usually frame it is that I tell people don't write plots, right? Write like set the stage, There is agency that the GM brings to the table. And I do think it is the GM's responsibility to create an exciting and engaging environment for the players to do things in. That doesn't mean they have to do what you bring to the table, but you need to have something there, because in absence of that, you can find yourself with a bunch of players who don't know what to do and don't want to take that responsibility onto themselves.
Well, I think it's, I love the way you phrase that. It's like players who don't know what to do and don't want to take that responsibility onto themselves, because that's a loaded statement. Because earlier we said the players are the protagonists. The players are the inciters of action.
Well, no, the characters are the protagonists. The players are people who came to the table and want to have fun and throw dice at each other.
You have that distinction, but it's also kind of funny that, like, what kind of player shows up at the game and doesn't want their character to do anything? Like, how passive are you?
No, I agree. I don't think it's a universal problem, but I do think it's one that many people will experience, and it is that.
Oh well, it's more endemic to some games. So, like, once again, I'm not ragging on Vampire for this, but Vampire is very much a make a character, sculpt them, and define them, and answer a lot of questions about being. So a lot of Vampire is about presenting yourself and performing as a vampire. You're not necessarily really motivated to actually do things in Vampire. You are an immortal. You can just wait for all this to blow over.
Yeah, there is that, like, now you guys can, like, talk to each other and stuff if you want kind of thing that I think is very a real danger of Vampire.
It's a huge danger of like, we've talked about the GM a player and players GMs. I've been in GM-less games before, and unstructured games like that, and a huge problem with them is they become very passive. Players, by definition, like, have the character and they want the character to be really cool, and no one wants anything done against, doesn't want their character to be less than cool. They don't want to be diminished, except in some rare cases. You'll run up with a lot of stasis in the game, where everyone's standing around and no one wants to upset the apple cart. This is why you have a game master who's, like, the game master has to be detached from everyone else. They don't have their own character. They have an infinite supply of supporting characters, any of which could be destroyed. Which, we already talked about kill your darlings. So because the game master is elevated and detached, they can make things happen in the game. Because it's like, I don't care if my guys get killed or die in horrible, spectacular moves. So I can make a bunch of two guys to come in with guns and upset that. Like that's why the GM role is important. And, right. So the GM's job, and in fact, I will even reinforce the GM's job is to kick people in the butt when nothing is happening, and incite the players. And to motivate the players, you would have to know what the players want to express in the world. This is why, I would agree with you that players can be a GM in the world, but if so, they have to craft some of the world and take some of that responsibility of making an interesting character themselves. This is where I shake my fist at this. It's like the players aren't passive little babies who show up and say, "You've entertained me now." If you're going to insist that the players have agency in the world, they have a responsibility to engage with the world themselves.
Yeah, I think I've personally found too, though, that it's a lot easier to make that jump. It can be role-playing can be scary for a lot of people. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's weird. It's weird to put on a performance, to put on a character who is not yourself. You're essentially lying, and you're doing it publicly in front of your friends, or in the case of Twitch, in front of the internet. And a lot of people need a little bit of a kick, like you said. And I think that
it's a game for a lot of people. You're supposed to have fun. What you're describing of, I got to be performative and people are watching and judging me, is not fun for everyone.
It's true. It's true. And I will say, even as someone who loves that, and those of you who have played with me know that I love to play ridiculous characters. Even for people like me, if you put my character in a white featureless room with nobody else in it and said, "Go perform," go role play.
You wouldn't have anything to work off of. You need a base material, and then you can react to that.
Yes, what you need is a dude with an eye patch and bad breath who has a treasure map.
And even when it comes down to like players contributing, some people, are more anxious than others, or maybe just don't have anything to say, or like they haven't gripped on to like what's happening here yet, but in other games they have. But so they can do something, but they're not into it yet, and you gotta wiggle around people.
I got an angry Rafferty old school here. If you read a lot of old games that had random character design, they would often say, if you didn't roll what you wanted, rise to the challenge of role playing. Sure, you rolled the different species and you actually wanted to play, but why don't you make a game of it? Just rise to that challenge and do something that's less than optimal. And like, I say this because this must sound like moon language.
I remember those days.
I
don't remember those days.
Yeah, so the funniest part is where
superheroes game,
where this exists at character creation with other people. You're sitting at the table and you go, "I don't really know what I want to play. Everyone else pick what they want to do first," and then you get things. You get your class because it's the last one no one wanted to pick. And you make all of your positive choices. This is the character you wanted to make too, and then you just don't know what to do with it.
Which, like I said, on the one hand, I thought that was kind of random generation supposed to spur you to get outside your comfort zone and play something different. But the problem is modern games have so much intelligent design choices you're supposed to make, and a lot of text in the book telling you your choices are valid, pick whatever you want, that you can wind up with a lot of passive designs, like people who are like you said, but they want to have fun. You can also wind up with people who are too overzealous and are very commanding about it, which I have been talking about. But really, and I'm just like suggesting I guess the issue I'm having here is I'm still not hearing enough kicking the players in the butts. It's like, instead of telling them, I will agree to not make a linear game, but you have to make a character who cares about something. Ban all neutrals and ban all chaotic goods. You have to care about something in the world so I can put something in the game. Because if I say, if I ask the players what they want, I get your featureless room thing, but also if I ask you what your character wants to do, you should be able to tell me. That's why our games have mottos in them. So when a player pauses and says, I don't know what to do, I say, what's your motto? Read that out loud, and what would that inform your decision? Now we're getting somewhere.
I will say, like, as a GM, as a tool in my own toolkit, usually asking players, like, initially to prompt them just like, who's a friend of your character is usually a pretty good one to start with, because you can do a lot of things with it. You can put them in danger, you can have them come to them with a problem, or you can just have them come by and talk through a thing. And that's usually a good way to get them going into something and caring about something, because they've already created a second character that only needed a couple of characteristics, like a single sentence.
Yeah, I mean, I do worry that this whole kind of wishy-washy neutrality also has a low opinion of players. Like, I've been in games, I guess it's getting to a tangent, but I've been in games before where I've wanted to get involved in the world and be involved with it, but it's so scripted and the game has such a low opinion of me that it doesn't matter. Like, when I rant about Tyrant Queen, it's kind of like Tyrant Queen just assumes I'm going to fight for Waterdeep or whatever. And it's like, this doesn't feel like a choice I'm actually making. It feels arbitrary, and I don't understand why I'm doing it.
I'm going to say something also, because I think it goes from old school to new school, especially in Dungeons and Dragons. If I remember correctly, first edition DMG, it talked a lot about essentially homebrewing your own world, and it put all the onus on the GM, right? Oh, you construct this, do that, and then when you go to fifth edition, and this also seen mostly more modern, is they make a lot of the advice for GM is like, well, have you read a book? Have you watched a movie? You want to make it like a Swatch book? Which again puts the onus on the GM exclusively. You have to bring the world to life, and your players just have to play in it. And that, I think, is part again of that scripting idea, that it's the GM who decides this world is flat or an obelisk or something floating in space, or there's this, which could be fun, but it's like, well, if these are my rules and this is how it happens, the tendency is then, well, what happens? The player says, but I want to, let's bring a situation where I brought in a established campaign and one character really wanted to have a gun. And I said, no, the way this world works is that literally the gods will prevent you from having a gun. Even though the 5th edition rules has
my dream America.
Have the rules for guns.
And I will say that I do like some of the rise of Blades in the Dark and Powered by the Apocalypse Session 0 games, where we decide the world and build it with each other. Like Ars Magica is an old game that did that, where like once again the players can go ahead and build stuff, and that way you can, once again, I always want to reinforce, if the player positively puts something in the experience, that's something they want as a positive experience. If you ask a player, and they decide a location that's filled with happy kobolds who mine turnips or whatever, that's something the player thinks is interesting to them and would want to see represented some way in the world, and it wouldn't be such a vacuum. I think one thing we haven't talked about a lot here is when it comes, I usually don't call it a toolbox. I noticed that the wording I use is toy box. That whenever I fire up a campaign like Roll20, I'll have another map that's simply called toy box. And that's where I cut and paste all the monsters and maps and set pieces that I want to use. And so when something comes up in my game, and I like calling it a toy box better, because now I feel like I'm better as a response. Like, if you guys need you go to a bad place in town and get attacked by a bunch of creeps, I can go in the toy box and grab a bunch of thieves I already have set up and throw them in front of you. It's not so much a tool, it's I brought the right toy for the improv that we're doing today. If you guys want to go to the monastery, or you want to go to the thief, or you want to go in the sewers, or you want to go to the corporate offices, I have several stock resources I can bring out and use for you. Not just random tables. I know people talked about that, but if you game with me long enough, you'll see some of my stock characters appear, and that's fine. I'm willing to roll with it. I can pull out the things that I need to go ahead and use with you. And this is like one of the things we're about preparing. A lot of times people are preparing scripts of go here, go here, go here, go here, do this, and only one outcome. And I would really suggest that what you should be doing is you should be planning a lot more like fronts, blades in the dark kind of thing of ticking clocks of here are a bunch of things going on, or here's one dread important thing that's going on. And after a certain amount of time, something is going to happen. And then your players need to, you present your players with some information of here's a bunch of shit that's going on. By the way, you might care about this in the world one. And then the players get involved with that and they'll feel like they're in a world. I think that compartmentalizes it and makes it feel, that's a better tool for building the world rather than what you really don't want to hear, which is a GM saying, sorry, guys, I can't do what you obviously want to do because I haven't prepared for it. And I realized, that can happen, but no one wants to hear that, especially when the GM burned themselves out doing a bunch of prep on stuff people didn't actually want to do.
Yeah, well, that's when people talk about scripts, and that they're speaking of like, oh, there's a political drama with an evil vizier, and the characters are gonna like try to find out who it is, and they're gonna discover it's the evil vizier, and then he's gonna like throw a dragon at them, right? Like that's a script, but there's another way to tackle it, which is what you guys are kind of describing. I frame it differently in my head. I think of it more like setting up dominoes. You're creating a situation that is rife with potential conflict and chaos.
Well, but like I said earlier, like, why do I give a shit about this vizier? Like, I kept complaining about, like, Tyrant Queen, which is, why do I care if Waterdeep falls? It's full of assholes. And,
right.
So why do I care about this vizier? It's like, how is this going to change the world? Is anyone I know going to get hurt? Can I manipulate this to my personal advantage? And if, you're not involving, if you're just telling me, no, this is what you do because you're the player, then you're telling me to shut up and stop engaging.
Yeah, well, you're talking about hooks in this, in this play, in this set piece that you're creating. And it's important to have hooks and have them be personal to the characters. But I also think that, like, if you looked at Tyrant Queen, if Tyrant Queen was written more as a toy box or a toolbox or something, if the war for the Tyrant Queen was more of a backdrop or a setting and less of a script, maybe it's setting versus scripts, then you would have this interesting brewing conflict, and your players could decide where they fit within that conflict, what side they're fighting for. It's the is it the Maltese Falcon? It's that interesting thing where, like, here's the MacGuffin, and it's not like there's one villain who's got it. There's like 3 separate factions, and they're all vying for it. And then it's your players' decision where they fit within this, clockwork world. And their decisions are what are ultimately going to write the story of what's going to happen. But you still have those other influences. That stuff is really fun. I think that's what Lessons was getting at with his toolbox approach.
Yeah, when I talk about toolbox, also it's like in the past I used to be more of a scripted guy, more like follower, and that led me to a lot of frustration. Partly because I had to do a lot of prep that either never got used or got ignored, or some cases deliberately subverted because I wasn't communicating with my players and understanding where they were coming from. Right. So,
well, that is.
But when and that's part of other problems as well. So when I went to the toy box or toolbox approach, and I think it's almost about approach as well, I felt I unloaded a lot of stuff that I thought I had to bring or had to carry with me all the time, and I always had to put down, like, this has to happen. It's like, well, what if the players, for example, there was in my last D&D campaign, there was a noble, the new character, he was a noble, and he says, oh, by the way, I wanted city, which is Greyhawk, to deal with the thing about my noble family. That wasn't in my bingo card of stuff that could happen and was planned, but it was like, well, that's a great idea. The city's there. There's a part of the game that is political. He's a noble. Let's go. Let's just go. Let's go there and do the thing.
I think that's a good example of the player, like, taking at least a step to create something for you. It's like, hey, here's a conflict that we could do. Why don't we do it?
Yeah.
I think that's always good.
And that's really cool, because I think in that you're finding the GM agency also, though. You're using what's been created, what's been added to the world. You're using your character's choices. They have pushed the ball forward down the field. I don't know why I use this football metaphor. I don't like football. I don't watch it. But I think it works because, again, the thing that I'm trying to get at too is I feel like there's this implication with like non-scripted game running that the GM is sort of just this improvisational master. And what I want to get at is that the GM is making decisions too. They're just making decisions the way players are making decisions by reading the state of the world and making decisions based on that world state that will influence the game, hopefully in interesting ways, you know? Like, the villain could lose the MacGuffin to the players, and you could say, okay, well, they're trying to get the MacGuffin back. But you could also take that and say, oh, the villain is going to go speak to another villain. And now, a dragon shows up. Like, this is a weak example, but what I'm trying to say is that, like, the GM has plenty of opportunity to express themselves creatively in the game. Like, I feel like the argument and the reason why I think a lot of us start with a very script-based game style is because we're kind of trained to do that based on the way adventures are written and based on what we see how we see games working, which makes it feel like it's emulating a traditional narrative structure. And you want to capture that, and so you have this very like tight-fisted approach,
Right, and I want to build on that and saying, like, I like your suggestion that the GM is a player, and I'm going to keep repeating, but the players are GMs. It's like it's easy to look at it as perspective of the players do whatever they want, and the GM rolls and improvs with it. That's how I've often looked at it. But we should also, like, the players should be able to improvise and roll with the situations that are presented to them and literally build pieces of the world. This is why, like, I was down on session 0 because I thought this is a waste of time because the players don't get to dictate anything. They're just going to passively react anyway. But now that I think about it, if you let the players, like, suggest things like the example I was using, which is if a D&D player showed up with nobility as the background, they might say, well, how does my family feel about this? And then suddenly we have to improv. The player brought their own resource to the table, and the player is saying, how does this work with what I'm bringing to the table as my arena? You could have another person saying, what does the Wizard College think about this? Or D&D, what does my deity think about this? Like, does anyone ask that? Or if you're a warlock, hey, what do the demons think about this? They're the ones who give me supernatural power. And bringing those kind of improv tools in building the world, if everyone was bringing to this and improving, and I think if you really dig deep in the stream games, you'll see that, where they'll the players bring their own lore and their own invented stuff to the table. And then, the GM rolls with that, but the players are also supposed to improv and roll with the GM. That yes, and theory, we should all be sculpting the world together. Instead of like what we see with the script, where the GM presents a scripted dungeon and the players crack stupid pop culture jokes while killing everything in them and moving on to the next objective. We should all be working together, to build that and build off of each other of what we're doing. Because otherwise, I think if the GM's job is just be a babysitter and entertain all the players, that can lead to GM burnout. And I guess I really want to get this in before we run out of time. This also means that you really need to get rid of get rid of characters, not necessarily players. Get rid of characters that aren't going to fit. Like, what really annoys the crap out of me about D&D 5 is when they said, you can play evil characters. Because now that means if a player shows up with an evil character, it's the game is telling you as a GM, if someone wants to be chaotic evil, you're supposed to roll with it. And no, I'll say, if
but
you're
it's more
GM
than that. It's more than that because you have we have this book where there's giant elephant people, and okay, now we never established that there were giant elephant people in this world.
But now you got to, because it's in the book.
Well, as I'm fond of pointing out, they do have a side. Dragonborns are the only ones that get the side note saying they're not in every D&D world, so they might not be in yours. But every world's got chaotic evil warlocks in it. So, but more to the point, it's like your campaign's going to be specific. You might want to run a hack and slash game; those are fun. Mm-hmm. You might want to run a political intrigue game. But if somebody shows up with a character that you think isn't going to fit, you need to stop them right there. It's not, players aren't allowed to bring any character they want. If you're going to talk about how you can homebrew the game, I mean, this is probably a different discussion, but it's all, it's like, if you're going to sculpt the experience, you're going to sculpt the experience. It's like, you shouldn't be players have a responsibility. This is part of Loader Mulch. Players have a responsibility to engage with the world, and the GM has a responsibility in engaging world. If somebody's doing something they shouldn't, we need to stop it. And I think that's a problem we don't talk about a lot, where if a player's character, this is back to Loader Mulch, if the player's character isn't engaged with the world, the player's playing the wrong character. Players only got one job, and that's to engage with the world. Write up a different character who gives a shit.
All right. So I think with that, let's go ahead and lead off. Red, you got anything you want to go ahead and end this off with? I'll give you like the last word here, I think.
Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. I mean, to me, the most interesting part of this whole conversation is that that jump between running a game with a script and then moving into a space where you feel more comfortable improvising and being more creative. And I just want to double down and underline that just because you're not writing the whole story does not mean that you give up all agency as a player in the game. There's a lot of creativity that you can still bring to the game that your players will appreciate and that you will have fun doing as well. But you do have to frame it as, I think you have to frame it as scenery or setup and not plot. You have to understand that you're setting the stage, you're setting the table for a food fight. And so you want to make that part really, really interesting. That's where you get to spread your wings. But, don't force them into, a dragon fight because you think that would be really cool.
Alrighty then. So I think with that, that's going to be it for today for Notes from the Aleph. We stream episodes bi-weekly Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can come join us live at twitch.tv at twitch.tv/Ractus. We stream and record weekly tabletop games at the same channel, and you can come join us when we start at 10 a.m., 2 p.m., and 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sundays and Wednesdays. Norman Rafferty here is a partner and writer for Sanguine Games. Check out sanguinegames.com, join us on the Red and Twitter, and look forward to the upcoming Book of Quarrels Ironclaw expansion book. Don't forget to check out RedRabbit and book him for a game over at startplaying.games as RedRabbit, and be sure to check out Lessons Learned at Lessons Learned 1 on YouTube and Twitch. And of course, be sure to check out all of his stuff over at Amazon as well. And be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and come see us all again. Until next time, everybody. See ya.
Bye.